So we're here to discuss how the coalition should restructure the tax system. So after another event, it's probably time to move on. And to discuss this important question, which obviously is particularly important, partly because of the increases in the level of taxes planned by the coalition, but also because the coalition has some specific plans for restructuring the tax system, and also because there are some overhang issues that New Labour hadn't dealt with, and some failures of tax policy which need to be addressed. But to discuss these and more, I have we've got, starting from this end, we've got William Morris, David Smith, David B. Smith, so I think he's known these days, Jesse Norman and John Redwood. So without further ado, I shall turn the floor over to William Morris.
Thank you very much, Andrew. One of the, and I apologise for my voice in advance. One of the advantages of going first is that I won't have to deal with any of the issues relating to child benefit. I'm a corporate tax lawyer. I'm the chairman of the CBI Tax Committee, and therefore I'm just going to talk about corporate taxes. Obviously, everybody else can broaden it out after that. I think I have to say that really, on balance, things seem to be going pretty well. The position which was announced by the government in the budget, and particularly some of the consultation documents which have come out since then, I think show a real awareness of the need to make the UK corporate tax system more competitive. And I think it's important to say, I mean, the Chancellor said this in the hall yesterday, I think it's important to say, there isn't a great deal of money to throw around at the moment, and the position of business is actually not to hold the begging bowl out, but it's mostly to say, when you think of changing, do it steadily. But for the most part, let's have a deliberative process here to think about how we do it. And what the government has done, in terms of the consultations it set out in relation to the taxation of overseas income, relating to control from corporations, all of these things which come up in the newspapers from time to time, is to say, okay, we're going to look at this as a whole. And one of the troubles of the last government was that, it would pick something over here, it would pick something over here, and it would pick something over here. And none of it hung together. And what the government's talking about, in particular in terms of coming out with a roadmap for corporate tax reform, I think is absolutely the right thing to do. Sorry. I personally think that one of the most exciting developments, and this, I speak as somebody who once worked at a treasury, although not the UK treasury, is the document that they came forward with on the changes to the tax policy making process. One of the things that this country has been plagued with over the past 20 or 30 years, I'm not going to heap blame on any one party, is that policy has been made on a completely ad hoc basis. If a problem arose, a solution was found to the problem, the policy was then designed to sort of fill in behind that problem. But if you build something in that sort of Heath Robinson-ish manner, things are going to topple over, things aren't going to make sense, you're going to need to slap more things on top of that. What the government was talking about, what the government has been talking about in terms of changing the tax policy making process, both in the Treasury and in Parliament, and then things like the Office of Tax Simplification, I think could be huge steps forward. Because if policy is thought of, if people know what policy is and can comment on it as it's going forward, if they can get involved in that process, if there is some effective form of parliamentary scrutiny, then legislation is going to be better, or it should be better. So I think that all of those things are really very important. As far as the competitiveness of the tax system is concerned, we can't turn the UK into Ireland, but we can turn it, I think, into the most competitive country around. And certainly the cut in the corporate tax rate, and particularly a stepped cut in the corporate tax rate, I think sends a very important message on that. Now, there's been a lot of talk about the deleterious effect of raises in the personal top personal tax rate, the NIC changes, the pension changes. In one sense, I think all of that is right. In another sense, I think it's going to be very difficult to do anything about that immediately. I mean, despite what we were saying about spending going up in one sense, there are going to be cuts in certainly large areas of public services. And I think it's going to be difficult at the moment to reverse those. But I think what the tax system needs, because I don't think that, my job title is Tax Policy Director for GE for Europe. So I look across the whole of Europe. I worked in the US, I worked for the US Treasury, so I look back there as well. No other country is in great shape at the moment. No other country is in a position to radically change its tax system to offer the benefits that we're not in a position of doing. So what the government has to do at this stage is to set out an appropriate direction of travel. I don't think it has to do anything right now other than hold steady, because in the end, what business needs is some type of stability. If it has the direction that it knows that people are moving towards, it has that tax policy process, actually right so that people can get involved in it, then I think we're going to be okay. But to try and change everything around and then change it again and change it again, as has happened particularly over the past 10 years, has been a bit of a disaster. So, I think we do need to move towards a competitive tax system, and we need to set out a process for doing that, and people need to know that it's going to happen, but I don't think it needs to happen today.
Okay, thank you, Liam. And now I'll turn to David B. Smith.
Right, can you all hear me first of all?
Yeah.
Right. First of all, there's absolutely no mystery about the features which should be found in a well-designed tax system. These have been known since Adam Smith's Maxims appeared in Volume 2 of The Wealth of Nations. A well-designed tax system should have the following systems. First, taxes should be imposed at the lowest rate possible in order not to distort economic behaviour. Taxes should also be flat rate and proportionate to the abilities to pay. Second, the tax system should be as simple as possible to reduce compliance costs, and there should be minimal exemptions. Exemptions encourage lobbying and political corruption. Third, citizens should know the structure and the level of tax faced with as much certainty as possible. Otherwise, long-lived investments, including in human capital, will not be undertaken. The main justification for running budget deficits in a recession, in fact, is tax smoothing, not their alleged stimulatory effects, which are non-existent. Fourth, taxes should not be discriminatory between citizens, either as individuals or as a class. Fifth, arbitrary windfall taxes and retrospective tax changes are economically damaging, but they are also an affront to the rule of law. People who advocate such taxes are behaving in the manner of Tudor tyrants such as Henry VIII or Henry VII, his grasping Welsh father. I'm now going to move on to macroeconomic aspects of tax policy, but I need to emphasise one point immediately. That is, in a globalised international economy, the consequences of a bad tax system in driving physical, human and financial capital elsewhere are far larger than they were in the 1970s, for example. One of the many damages caused by large budget deficits is that businessmen calculate that these will mean higher future taxes and decide to locate elsewhere. Now, I'm sure that most of you here will have heard of a Laffer curve. That is the idea that if you plot the rate of tax on the horizontal axis and tax receipts on the vertical one, you get an inverted U-shape akin to the normal distribution in statistics. The implication is there are normally 2 points on the Laffer curve that will generate the same rate of tax. Also, beyond the peak of the Laffer curve, higher rates of tax mean falling receipts. Now, there are numerous micro-Laffer curves that vary from tax to tax. Just about everyone who has looked at the evidence has concluded that 50% higher rate on income tax, which is actually 56% allowed for national insurance contributions, and the new 28% rate of capital gains tax will both be on the wrong side of their respective micro-Laffer curves and will destroy output, revenue and jobs. The bigger question is whether the British economy is on the wrong side of the aggregate Laffer curve. If it is, any attempt to tax one's way out of the fiscal deficit bequeathed by Labour is one, doomed to failure, and two, likely to produce a downward spiral in private activity of a tax base. I believe that the answer to this question is a firm yes. The reason is the unprecedented peacetime size of the British state. I published an article in the December IEA Economic Affairs examining the size of the UK public sector back to 1900, which was actually quite a tricky exercise in clear metrics. One conclusion was that it was better to use the factored cost measure of gross domestic product, which excludes indirect taxes, rather than the officially preferred market price GDP figure, which is gross of indirect taxes. The difference is noticeable, especially when indirect taxes are rising. The June 2010 budget indicates that general government spending will be 46.7% of market price gross domestic product in 2010-11, down 0.5 percentage points on the year, whereas the equivalent ratio using the more accurate factor cost measure will be 53.2%, down 0.1 percentage point on 2009-01. So the apparent reduction in the tax and spending ratios is because they've pushed up GDP through raising VAT. It's logically impossible for government to tax itself. It is correspondingly arguable that with non-oil taxes equivalent to 84% of non-socialised factor cost GDP, we are unambiguously on the wrong side of the Laffer curve. However, economies are complex dynamic systems with many feedbacks, and it's worth looking at the evidence from macroeconomic forecasting models. I'm going to quote from the University of Warwick Macroeconomic Modelling Bureau in 1993. This is not new, we've known this for years. In order to analyse the impact of various fiscal policy instruments, it is essential to consider both direct and indirect effects. For example, the direct effect of tax changes on government finances can be quantified through an assessment of the size of the tax base to which the tax change is to be applied, and such calculations may measure the short-run impact on government revenue quite well. However, over a period beyond the first few months following tax change, the indirect effects through the operation of the economy as a whole come to dominate. Note how quickly. Simulations of models of a macroeconomy are the only method of quantifying the size and time profile of these indirect effects. This insight is crucial given the fiscal mess that the coalition has inherited. The easiest course is to appease the spending lobbies while surreptitiously raising the tax burden on the rest of the community. The front-end loading of a VAT hike and the rear-end loading of the spending cuts, which are the stage of pie in the sky, suggests the coalition government may have embarked on this course. However, having simulated the effects of a VAT hike on my own forecasting model, I believe that 20% VAT hike will both destroy output and jobs and exacerbate the budget deficit by 1/4 to 1/2 percentage point of gross domestic product. My main concern about the appointment of Robert Choate to head the Office of Budget Responsibility, the OBR, is that he's moved across from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, whose calculation of effects of tax changes have always been first-round static ones. Whereas the danger that the OBR will always end up advocating higher taxes as a solution to the deficit problem. Now, this danger is exacerbated, of course, by the fact that the OBR has been almost entirely staffed by former seconded HM Treasury officials and runs the Treasury forecasting model. This has almost no supply-side effects incorporated in it. One technical reason is the model is run on the assumption that national output quickly locks onto a predetermined growth trend. Now, this is assumed. This trend is extrapolated using off-model assumptions about productivity, working hours, the employment rate and population. However, none of these assumptions have any behavioural content. An income tax rate of 100% would have the same implications for trend growth as one of 0 in the Treasury model. The resulting complacency about the effects of big government contrasts sharply with the rule of thumb which comes out of 35 years of international studies, that adding 1 percentage point to the government consumption ratio reduces the growth of real national output per head by 0.15 percentage points. The 8.4 percentage point rise in the British government spending ratio between 1996-2000 and 2006-2010, which smooths out the recession, would correspondingly be expected to reduce growth by 1.25 percentage points. The implication is that the UK sustainable growth rate is now only some 1.25 to 1.5%, Eurosclerosis in other words. Against this background, the government's main priority should be the nurturing of the private sector supply side. I'll now turn to my concluding remarks. First, one reason that more has not been said about the structure of the tax system is that this issue is lesser importance in terms of social cost-benefit analysis when compared to the damage that will result. The coalition ignores the adverse dynamic effect of increased taxes. Second, this does not mean that the details of the tax structure are unimportant. There are clearly free lunch gains to be achieved by cutting high marginal rates wherever these are beyond revenue maximising point on the micro-Laffer curve. And of course, we had an excellent report from Lord Forsyth in 2006, which looked to reform the tax system. Third, one aspect of what I like to call the triumph of the Tories' timorous tendency is that the Conservatives have never challenged the big spending and high tax anti-libertarian rhetoric which Labour and Liberal Democrat politicians employ so freely. This may partly because the Conservative element of the Cabinet is heavily composed of what in the trade are known as wealth conservators rather than wealth creators. Fourth, the danger is that the American terminology, nothing to do with whether you went to Eton or not, is known. Fourth, the danger is that the coalition are now consolidating Gordon Brown's gargantuan state power grab, not rolling spending back to the share of GDP that prevailed 10 years ago, for example. The political risk that Mr Cameron is taking is that this policy will fail economically and the Conservatives will end up taking the blame. Finally, while the government will be spending over 53% of the factor cost measure of GDP this year, very little of its expenditure will be on the so-called primary governmental functions of defence, 3.1% of GDP, and law and order, 2.7%. Even including debt interest only brings the primary total to 9.2%. In contrast, almost 83% of government spending and 44.5% of factor cost GDP consists of secondary functions, and these are well-known sort of terminology, with social services, health and education summing up to 62.75% of spending and 33.75% of GDP. A truly Conservative government could double the defence budget when it would still be a smaller share of GDP than in the early 1980s and still have ample scope to cut back the governmental fat that is clogging up the arteries of the British economy. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you very much, David. So now we'll move on to Jesse Norman.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and thank you, David. Gosh, I enjoyed that. I thought it was a magnificent blast of fresh air and clarity in the debate. I'm not absolutely, for reasons you perhaps understand, as negative on the possibility that the government will be complacent about the state's power grab under Gordon Brown, but we can talk about that in the questions if you'd like. Let me start by giving a book of mine coming out in November, a big plug. I hope you'll excuse that. It's called The Big Society. It has the great merit of not talking about taxes at all, but it does talk a lot about the sources of economic growth. And that, I think, is an enormous part of the fundamental debate that we're engaged in now. And it very much picks up the point about behavioural factors within the public understanding of economics, because it is absolutely clear that the government, as an institution across the ministries, and I'm afraid also across the politicians, have in my view, a very kind of impoverished textbook conception, very static conception of what economics is. And in particular, they ignore what I take to be the three pillars of economic success, which are successfully functioning independent institutions, competition, and entrepreneurship. And I think the point you're making, David, about dynamic effects and wealth creation rather than wealth conservation is absolutely right. Now, and the impact and the importance of supply-side reform. I would say just a couple of things. I think to start by just noticing one thing, which is it's important to distinguish between the costs of government administration of the tax system and the costs of compliance. I mean, but both sides of that equation are grossly over what they should be for this country at the moment, and it's very regressive. So the burden of tax across tax compliance in particular falls, I think one recent study found, 16 times harder on small businesses than on large ones. So if you are interested in these kind of dynamic effects and on entrepreneurship and wealth creation, that's a very urgent early priority, is to reduce the impact of taxation on small and medium-sized business in particular and on business as a whole. Fascinatingly, if you look across the whole of the OECD, tax collection costs at the moment are falling in general for the majority of OECD countries, but not, you'll be surprised to learn, in this country. Our total cost, which is a fiendishly difficult thing to estimate, but the most recent thing I've seen on this estimates the total cost of tax compliance and admin at between 15 and 20 billion pounds a year. Now, even by Gordon Brown standards, that's not chicken feed. So that is something I think we need to turn our urgent attention to. And it's also a symptom of a greater pathology. Don't forget, we've emerged from 13 years of a government that thought that legislation was like turnover. In a company, you had as much of it as you possibly could. That kept Parliament busy, no inconvenient MPs asking questions that might embarrass the Prime Minister, an endless stream of idiotic press announcements to keep the media happy. You can see how this pathology has taken shape. And one of the effects of that is that finance acts are now annual events, and of course, they are 3 times on average longer in the 2000s than they were in the 1990s. So we are drowning in largely ill-conceived financial legislation. And to return to a point that David made, I thought very eloquently as well, there's a genuine question as to the compatibility of this line of activity with the rule of law. You cannot have a rule of law where people do not know what the law is. It's very hard to know for large chunks of the tax code, and if there is, it seems true, other parts of the legal system, what the law actually is. So there's a fundamental issue to be addressed. Now, we haven't really talked about what to do in particular. Let's leave that for the questions, but I do just want to make that linkage between wealth creation, the public understanding of economics, the pathology of government we have at the moment, and the threat to this more fundamental issue of legality, rule of law, and legal compliance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jesse. And for our contributions before we open to questions, John Redwood.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's difficult to know where to begin because the political debate is so hollowed out and so misleading in this country. So I think in order to have a sensible discussion on tax, we need first of all to have a few numbers. The Treasury produces lots of numbers and the media and most MPs don't seem to read any of them, so that we know what the background is to the current fiscal mess. And the first thing to look at is what is actually happening to spending. If you listen to the sound bites, it's about to be cut by 25%. But of course it isn't about to be cut. The Red Book makes very clear that spending is going to go up every year over the next 5 years. In the last Labour year, spending was 600 billion, that's current total public spending, and that was 09-10. What is it going to be in 14-15? It is going to be 690 billion pounds, or plus 15%. So then you get into real and nominal discussions. That's a 15% increase in cash. To me, that's an increase. If you're budgeting in a business, you budget in cash, and if you've got enough pounds, it works, and if you run out of pounds, it doesn't work. The government thinks it needs another 90 billion pounds to make it work over the next 5 years. If their Bank of England ever got down to target inflation, which is 2%, which is still well above anybody else's inflation in the Western world, that of course would be a real increase. Because 5 years at 2%, even compounding, is not as much as 15%. So the government is allowing itself real increases, very modest by historic standards, but real increases over the 5 years, and it's certainly allowing itself a wodge of extra fivers to try and keep things going. So what is actually happening, because they do want to bring the deficit down, is they are planning the most enormous tax increase in our history. Because if you take the similar figures for taxes, they say that by 14-15, they are going to be raising 176 billion a year more than the last Labour year. Let's just think about that figure. 176 billion a year more, 2014-15, compared with 09-10. So the coalition government thinks that Labour was undertaxing by 176 billion a year, and that's where it's going to take us over the 5-year period. None of you will believe any of these figures, but they are in the Red Book, and I do assume that the Chancellor and the Treasury put the figures in because they think they're going to come true. As we just heard from David, they may not come true, because if the economy doesn't grow by 2% per annum or so, which is the official forecast, then you won't get 176 billion extra tax out of it. And that is a worry that I presume the Chancellor and his advisors must have. But 176 billion is a lot of money. And of course, that means £3,000 per head extra for every man, woman and child by year 5 of the planned increase in taxes, or £12,000 for the average family of 4 extra in taxes. Or put another way, just to drive it home, 176 billion, or the £12,000 for the average family extra, is more than the total taxes in any year that Margaret Thatcher raised, apart from her last year, I think. So the plan is to put in as much tax as Margaret's government got away with every year as an additional amount of tax. My submission is that too much is being done by tax and not enough is being done by spending. I'm not sure we can afford the 90 billion increase, and I think burdening us with 176 billion a year extra tax by year 5 is rather a lot. Now, I agree with David that I think we're on the wrong side of the Laffer curve, and I've been trying to get my political colleagues to understand the Laffer curve. Now, most politicians in this modern parliament think in sound bites, and most of them think that taxing rich people and taxing bankers, and they think they're probably the same thing, although I don't think the bank clerk in my local Barclays thinks she's rich, but they seem to think that taxing bankers and taxing the rich is extremely popular because it polls very well, apparently. And so they say we're going to tax the rich more. So I've come up with the soundbite to try and woo them, because I've obviously got to try and influence these people on your behalf. And so my soundbite is, I too, believe it or not, would like to tax the rich more, and I'll tell you how to do it. You cut the rate. And it always works. It worked very well for Margaret Thatcher. She, with her chancellors, cut the marginal tax rate for an unbelievable communist level of 83%, which the previous Labour government had brought it in at. Most people under 40 or 50 cannot believe that you could have had a country with 83% tax. Well, we did. It didn't work, but we certainly had it. She cut the 83% rate to 40%, and two very interesting things happened. The amount of money the better off paid soared, and the amount of money as a proportion of total tax that they paid rose. Well, of course it did. More rich people came here. More rich people stayed here. They spent less on expensive accountants and tax avoidance schemes. They risked more money. They were more enterprising, so they made more money. So the rich paid a lot more tax because the income tax rate came down from a crazy and penal 83% to a then fairly competitive 40%. Now, I don't think 40% is that competitive anymore. I'm quite sure the 50% isn't competitive. And the argument over the Laffer curve is, where does the curve change shape? Where does it inflect? Because if you have the two axes, let's have the rates, 10%, 20%, 30%, etc., along here, and you've got the amount of revenue up here. The argument I had with the Treasury over capital gains tax was that I said the curve did that, and they said the curve did that. Now, very important victory, because for the first time, as a result of that long argument, the Treasury and the Chancellor in the budget speech admitted that there is a Laffer curve on capital gains tax. And the Chancellor said that the inflection point of the curve is, believe it or not, at 28%. He thinks he's hit the jackpot level. Very sensible to do so. That's what I was urging him to do. I said, set your capital gains tax at the level which maximises the take from the tax, because you clearly need plenty of revenue. I happen to think it's around 15%, and we will be returning to that argument before the next budget. The problem I have is that the immediate experience will show a surge in capital gains tax receipts for the current year when we get the money in, because lots of people went off and sold all sorts of things before the budget, so we'd have to try and get them to split the figures within the year, which they won't want to do, because the Treasury won't want to admit that I might be right and that this is wrong as the rate. But all the evidence which Adam Smith and others, the Institute, have collected show very conclusively in both America and Britain that the inflection rate is clearly below 20%. And whenever America and Britain have taken their capital gains tax rates above 20, the revenue has fallen. Now, where is the inflection point for income tax? People are even more lost on that, and I hope some are going to do some more studies to try and inform this debate. Different scale, but we'll ignore that complexity and just use the same inadequate graph. But maybe, I think, you're like that on income tax, and maybe the inflection point is around 37, something like that. The Treasury, if we can get them into the same argument, they're going to have to argue that it's 50 or higher to make sense of what they've done. But I suspect they're going to lose quite a lot of revenue from choosing a 50% tax rate. It's always difficult to prove because it's what would the revenue have been if other things had applied, and you never are sure about that, so you have to look at historical evidence and comparable countries. But Britain lives by international trade and by attracting footloose capital and talent. And so it seems to me to be very dangerous to be setting your marginal income tax rate as high as 50% when the world is going over to 25-30 as a more normal rate for serious jurisdictions. My message to the government is very simple. Asia is after our lunch. Asia is mighty competitive. Asia would love to have those big banks from the City of London, so that if we can't at least give them grudging acceptance here, if we're going to carry on treating them as whipping boys and girls and sound as if we want to lose them, one day we'll wake up and discover we have lost them. And then we'll discover there's one thing worse than having bankers making lots of money in London, and that's not having bankers making lots of money in London. And then my colleagues would be deeply sorry. They probably won't admit their mistake, but they'll be asking people like me, where's the tax revenue gone? And I'll say, well, it's in Shanghai, or it's in Hong Kong, or it's in Sydney, or wherever it's gone to. We are very vulnerable, so we need to understand the Laffer curve. We need to get it across to the politicians before we lose a lot more business. And going back to the main argument, I'd be mightily grateful if a few people would come into the debate and say, John Redwood hasn't made up all these figures. This is what is projected. This isn't a satisfactory profile of what's going to happen next, and we need to do much more on the spending figure so that we don't have to have the biggest tax increase in history.
Thank you very much for that, John. So now, in the questions, I just before we open it out, given that it was actually the title of the discussion, I thought I might press the panel just a little bit on the question of how they might restructure the tax system. So if I split that into two brief sorts of questions, it's supposed that we thought of taxes in three broad categories. So personal and indirect taxes, corporate taxes, and other taxes. So personal taxes might include things like income tax, and indirect taxes might be things like VAT, and then corporate tax, corporation taxes, perhaps some taxes on maybe dividends taxes, and then other taxes might include green taxes. So if I might just briefly ask you briefly to explain whether you see there as being it would be useful to rebalance in some way between those taxes, and if so, in what? And then I'll ask in a moment a second question about whether you think there should be a rebalancing within those categories.
Should we
start with David?
Yeah. First of all, I read a book for the IEA called Living with Leviathan that you can download from their website for nothing, or buy them, I think about £5 over the internet. And I actually looked at the whole issue of what is the best buy and the worst buy in taxation. And the first point is that we actually know an awful lot about it from studies that are being done in many countries using all sorts of methods.
Sorry, can everyone hear you?
Yes. Absolutely, the worst buy is to have high fixed overhead costs on employment, i.e. employers' national insurance contributions. And I have absolutely no idea why the Conservatives didn't point that out when Gordon Brown was raising employers' NICs. And that's why you have very high unemployment in continental Europe, where these things are far higher than they are in the UK.
Was the first week of the general election campaign, just to be fair?
Yes. I feel academic standards have collapsed in this country. You no longer say to people, you're stupid and idle and deserve to fail. I think the same applies to the Conservative Party, but in my heart of hearts, that is a feeling. I will say one thing slightly peripheral. People have looked at flat taxes, and I strongly recommend Alistair Heath's brilliant book on it, which can be downloaded from a Taxpayers Alliance. People, certainly like the Institute of Fiscal Studies, have always argued the optimal flat tax system is one with very high threshold. And the advantage of that is you take lots of poor people out of tax, so that the average tax paid by the rich is higher, while at the same time you have a flat marginal rate. I think, by chance, the Liberal Democrats going for a very high starting point actually does, in a way, take you onto the flat tax agenda. And if the Conservatives had any wit, they could actually sort of build on that to use as justification. My personal objection to it, again, in terms of political economy, is that if you take people out of tax, you actually exacerbate the free rider problem. But if you're not paying any tax, you vote for other people to pay taxes to spend money on your behalf. But I do think that that is an interesting area. As for the rest, the conventional wisdom until quite recently was that flat rate indirect taxes were the least distortionary and the least damaging. So that there was a case for switching, if you like, from high marginal rates of income tax to higher rate of value added tax. There has been a little bit of a tendency against that. But what I will say over and over again is you need to simulate these things, not just on one model, but on a range of models, see what the results are. The second round effects are absolutely dominant within a relatively short period. And if your absolute spending burden is 53% plus of national output, jiggling with the structure of the tax system is going to be a second order issue, because simply every decision anyone ever makes anywhere in the country is going to be dominated by the tax rather than the sort of real economic pluses and minuses from the decision involved. The other thing is capricious tax systems basically represent a breakdown of the rule of law. They're equivalent to primitive barbarism where the tribesmen come down and steal your cattle. No one will invest in a country where the tax system is capricious. The main concern in this country is that the government spending plans imply higher taxes and you don't know where they're going to hit. If you simply had an absolute cast-iron guarantee that the tax system as it is, onerous as it is not going to be exacerbated and all future overruns will come on spending, I think you'd be amazed at the supply side response just because people knew actually where they stood.
Okay, so just to maybe, if I take Jesse next, and I'll press you on two kinds of things. So would you think that there should be any restructuring between them? Like, so, for example, maybe additional green taxes relative to personal taxes? And also on this point, so David raised the point of the VAT rise. Why do you think the coalition chose to raise VAT rather than, say, basic rate income tax? Was it just that do you think they were overly impressed by old studies suggesting that VAT was less distortionary, as David suggested, or was there some other reason?
Well, I do think that the coalition was motivated by just a very simple view, which is it's a simple, transparent tax which applies to everyone, and the studies, if they looked at them, they probably did look at the older ones. They hadn't seen the later stuff. I mean, if anyone hasn't seen it, of course, the most devastating intellectual critique of this whole approach is contained in Andrew's own pamphlet, which is just outside. Anyone can pick up a copy on the way out if they'd like. I think green taxes should not be used in general to raise money. The point of green tax is to shape behaviour more than it is to raise money. If you look across the piece, I mean, I don't quite share your view on Alistair Heath's book on flat taxes. I'm in favour of very much of flattening taxes in many different ways, but of course there are two problems which people tend to forget. The one is, and this is what has to remind everyone of the politics of this, the first is you have an enormous cash flow problem while the dynamic effects kick in on the actual loss of short-term revenue, and the other problem is that a flat tax implies no exemptions. So if anyone's looking for their pension reliefs and all of the other things that give the middle class such joy in the tax system, they would be abolished under a flat tax. So before anyone gets too enthusiastic about flat tax, just think about the size of your pension pot and the beating it's taken over the last year or two, and ask yourself whether you really want the relief to go. I do think that rebalancing the economy is a fundamental long-term concern. We have an enormously consumption-led economy. It would be nice to rebalance more in favour of savings away from consumption. That's a 30 to 50-year project. I do think, frankly, I have a lot of sympathy for the Lawson approach. I like equalising taxation, ideally at lower rates as between capital gains and income. So, but I do think the point that I want to make, and the point that we forget, is it's really very important to think also about the cost of compliance rather than just the rates. It's the whole issue of supply side reform is very importantly geared to how people actually react to the vast mountain of paperwork they're being asked to fill in at the moment, and all the distorting effects that has on economic behaviour.
What about you, John? Would you like to see a big rise in green taxes?
No. I think the only way out of this that the British people will accept, and the political leaders could argue for, is to accelerate the British growth rate. If you accelerate the British growth rate, then your 176 billion of extra taxes is easier to collect because there's more income and wealth to take it from. And your proportion of national income, which may well be 53% going on state activities, falls more quickly without the politicians having to make difficult decisions to actually cut spending, which they're clearly finding difficult. I'm still struggling with why they should tell us they're going to be cutting it so much when their figures show us it's going to be going up. It seems to me to be the wrong way round. I would rather they spoke softly and acted a little bit more firmly, but they seem to have chosen to speak toughly and act softly, which is unusual. So what kind of tax reform would I go for? Well, in the current situation, yes, we need to raise more revenue more quickly because the deficit is unacceptably large and the interest burden is rising too quickly, and the politicians can't or won't cut spending. So I would say we need to raise more money from capital gains, so I would cut the rate immediately to 20%. I think we would raise more at 20 than we're going to raise at 28, and that would also be popular. No bad thing for politicians to occasionally want to be popular. I think on income tax, I would take the same view. I think we are not going to optimise our collection of income tax from the people most able to pay it, because I think 50% is driving the very high earners abroad in ever-increasing numbers very quickly. Having to live with the political reality, I will be a wimp and say let's just get it back down to 40. So I would have a 20% basic income tax rate, I'd have a 20% capital gains tax rate, I would take corporation tax down to 20% quickly. I wouldn't mess around with 1% a year, I wouldn't stick at 25. I would go down to 20 because I think that would send a really big signal to the world that we seriously wanted up and running big businesses to headquarter with us. The flow is all the other way at the moment. Wolsey went last week, one of our larger companies. Many more may well be going in the near future. Shell effectively went to Holland under the last government, and Holland has a much more competitive tax structure than Britain, and nobody can claim that Holland underspends or is some kind of cutthroat Asian competitor. So let's go 20-20-20 on everything we can, and I'm happy to live with, well, I'm not happy to, but I'm prepared to live with VAT at 20 to complete the symmetry. Now, the bank balances tax I find an interesting one. This is what politicians regard as a pain-free tax, or indeed even a popular tax, because they tell people that there is no price for the public in a balance sheet tax on the banks. It's those nasty bankers again, they're all super rich, it serves them right, and of course they'll keep their banks here and we'll just charge them a levy on their balance sheet. Now, I want my economy to grow more quickly. It is quite clear at the moment that there are not sensible sums of money available to small and medium-sized enterprise to borrow at all, and there are certainly not sensible sums available at a sensible overall charge, including all the not very well hidden costs as well as the interest rate for business to borrow and grow at a time when we're told we need a new industrial revolution in this country to rebalance the economy. One of the reasons there is very little money around from the banks for British business is that the regulator is making the banks shrink their balance sheet. And if a bank shrinks its balance sheet, it lends less. It's quite simple. Banks live in the reverse world. A loan to a bank is an asset because it's their money which they've lent to someone else. The deposit is the liability because that's your money that you've lent to the bank. If they're shrinking their balance sheet, they have to shrink their loans. That's exactly what's going on. The regulator needs to back off. And now the Chancellor has come in behind the regulator and given banks another reason to slim their balance sheets before the thing triggers at the beginning of next year. This is all very contractionary, it's very recessionary. And I'm trying to get them to understand that they need to back off if they want the fast growth rate, which is the only way out of this that the public will accept.
Okay, and William, perhaps something on corporate tax restructure. Would you see there as being a scope to considerably reduce corporation tax rates, perhaps increase other kinds of taxes, dividend taxes, or something else?
Yeah, I should say that if everybody else on the panel is Adam Smith, I think I'm the pin manufacturer. But, I'm happy to be here. In terms of corporate taxes, I'm glad the corporate rate is coming down. I would make the obvious point, which I think does need to be made because we've been talking about this in one sense at a relatively high level. We can cut the corporate rate, but if we do other things with allowances, for example, if the effective rate stays the same or goes up, then it's not going to make a damn bit of difference. Somebody can open the newspaper and see that the rate's gone down to 20%, but if their tax guy then comes in and tells them, well, actually, they took away everything else, so the effective rate that we're going to be paying is now going to be 30%. You haven't done any good. So, this needs to be looked at holistically. The whole thing needs to be looked at holistically. Just sticking with corporate taxes, we need also to look, and one thing we haven't talked about really is what the incidence of these taxes is. And certainly the incidence of the corporate tax really, I think it's fairly clear, it doesn't fall on the owners of capital. The incidence of corporate taxation actually falls on labour, and this goes a little to what David was saying. Actually, what Jesse was saying, I think about employers' NICs as well. That is a direct tax on labour. The corporate tax is actually an indirect tax on labour. And so, the more that you try and squeeze out of that, the less people are actually going to employ. It's a relatively simple equation from that point of view. So I do think that bringing the corporate rate down is a sensible thing to do. The government stepping it down 1% a year, that's fine. I think so long as people know that it's coming down, they know it's coming down. A lot of this is about what the expectations are 3, 4, 5 years out, because the way that we do our corporate planning is we make assumptions for 3 or 4 years. We don't make assumptions beyond that, but we're going to make the investment based on that. And again, the worst thing that can happen is people chop and change every single year, and in the end you just throw the whole thing up in the air and go, damn it, we're going somewhere else. I think that we do have to be careful about that. But as far as corporation tax is concerned, yes, I think that's fine. But dividend tax, I don't know. The US has experimented with, essentially cutting dividend tax, and I think that was seen, to have a beneficial effect. Can I just say a word about flat taxes, which I think in principle are actually a good idea, and I spent a fair amount of time, slightly strangely, working with some people in Slovakia on this. And the system that they've instituted there, I think, works quite well. Now you can say it's a much smaller economy. The danger between having all these disparate rates is that you will have a lot of people putting what should be entrepreneurial energy into what is essentially tax arbitrage. And therefore, if you have a 40% corporate personal income tax rate and you have a 20% capital gains tax rate, people are going to distort their activity to try and get into the lower rate, and that's really a waste of time. So I think that we need to sort of try and fit all those pieces together. I think again, an overall approach of looking at all of this and saying, okay, what is the whole tax system that we want?
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I'd like to open it out to questions now, and if you could say your name, and if you have a particular affiliation that you want to identify that before you ask your question. So we'll start with you, sir.
Richard Jackal, I'm from Dulwich and West Norwood constituency, but I'm just a member of the Conservative Party. I would just like to pick up on a point that William made, that what we're doing in the party and in government is that we are declaring a direction, and what marks us as Conservatives is our direction and not our perfection, because it might be a point to say we are human, we are not perfect. We must take into account all the political realities that we are faced with. Yes, we want an ideal tax system, of course. However, going from Gordon Brown's incredibly overbloated taxation system to some sort of extremely lean taxation system, whilst that might accrue more tax in the short term, we do need to look at the fact that there are other political variables what would the public think who didn't vote for us? What would the swing voters think who give us our political momentum to make changes if we suddenly throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, no chaps, it's entirely, we're risking it, we're making sure that everyone can fend for themselves, etc. Now, I understand what both Mr. Redwood and Mr. Norman are saying, and being the still small voice to the Chancellor is excellent. We need that sort of thinking. But perhaps rather than overturning the tables, if you may allow me to continue the Christian metaphor, it is not the best way forward. In terms of making sure we maintain our AAA rating as a national, from lenders to maintain national lending, do you feel that this form of taxation system would go as far as fast as the current reformations that the Chancellor has proposed?
Okay, so there we have a question. Would the kinds of, I suppose to some extent this is directed at John, so maybe I'll take him first and then ask for some reactions from others, but the suggestion is that the government's declaring a direction and that there are some broader political realities one has to be concerned about, how people that might not understand some of these niceties, swing voters and so on, might react if one were to have cuts in an environment of a large deficit. So what do you see as the relative political realities of this approach versus what the government's doing?
Well, the political reality is very simple, that either approach only works if the growth rate accelerates. I wrote a report for the Conservative Party at Mr. Osborne and Mr. Cameron's request, which we published before the credit crunch in 2007. The report forecast the credit crunch. That piece was deliberately suppressed by the media. And it also said that the trend rate of growth we would inherit would not be the 2.75% per annum that the Treasury said our trend rate of growth had reached under Mr. Brown, but we thought it would be around 1.5% to 2%. And I entirely agree with David that is where the trend rate of growth of this economy now is, because of this massive and reasonably inefficient public sector, and because of the huge debt overhang in both the private and the public sectors. And whilst we do the debt workout in both sectors, there is going to be less consumption, which is bad news for economic growth, and there is going to be less public consumption, which is bad news for economic growth. So we have to live through this debt workout period and find how we can accelerate the growth rate. If we can get more into investment and export, then the growth rate will be lifted. How do you do that? You do it by lower tax rates and by less regulation. It is terribly simple. And they've either got the will to do it or they haven't got the will to do it. I'm making it easy for them because I'm saying there's a bonus that if you actually were brave enough, as they see it, to cut the tax rates, you get more money in as well. So what is the problem?
Okay, maybe I'll ask Jesse to answer this.
Yes, I mean, I think the direction point is very important. I, however, do have a slightly different view on this to John. It's worth just fleshing out the difference. See, what I think matters is entrepreneurship and wealth creation. So I think there is a case for a bank levy, because one of the things it prevents is all of the taxable profits of that firm being paid out, all of the pre-tax profits being paid out, or a large chunk of it in bonuses to the team that year. It restrains the culture which is taking place. I am actually, and I'm saying this is a person who used to be a director of BZW, so I'm quite familiar with the city, and I know John has been the Rothschilds for many years, so we know both sides of the city, all sides of the city pretty well, and I myself do not think it is appropriate just to be waving through enormously high payments, pay, which is essentially on the basis of positional arrangement rather than on the basis of entrepreneurship and wealth creation. And I think Conservatives have a genuine interest in making sure that pay in the financial sector and in the corporate sector, I'm not singling out banks, is appropriate to the actual entrepreneurship and energy of the organisations involved. I mean, we shouldn't be yielding this up, and I'm not suggesting we should be imposing, direct pay schemes or any of that nonsense. But proper transparency, a bank levy, a concern about capital sums being paid to people on the basis of where they are in an organisation rather than on the basis of actual wealth creation and entrepreneurship, I think is a perfectly legitimate topic for people across the political spectrum, and certainly for Conservatives to take an interest in.
Okay, I'm going to take 3 questions this time, so I'll take a gentleman at the back there first.
Morning, John O'Connor from the Taxpayers Alliance. I just wanted to ask the panel whether they thought that fiscal decentralisation, where local areas had genuine revenue-raising powers, was a likely or desirable prospect in this Parliament and beyond.
Okay, and I'll go for this gentleman here next.
David McLean, I'm a small business in Birmingham. Seems one of the underlying issues is the rhetoric of growth seems to be completely lost in my working life. I mean, you know, the business of Britain is not business anymore, it's everything else but that. It seems that unless you can recapture that, one of the political realities will never change to allow the kind of taxation changes that never get political support. So I'm going to on whether we should, how we might start to exercise some kind of cultural change to get some room for actual growth, as John says.
Okay, and this gentleman.
There's been some shameless self-publicity of their literature this morning, so let me give John Redwood's blog a plug, online diary. We get this kind of great stuff every morning with the click of a mouse. But let me go on to flat tax and perhaps ask William, you mentioned Slovakia and having a look there. I read recently that it may be possible to have a flat rate of 20%, cutting in at £13,000 or £14,000. Is there any credence to those figures?
Okay, so there we have 3 questions. One about whether fiscal decentralisation is likely or desirable, and about how to create an ethic of growth, culture of growth, and whether a flat tax of 20% coming in at 13,000, 14,000 is desirable. So maybe I'll start with David.
Okay, fiscal decentralisation I'll start with. First of all, we are in the city of Joseph Chamberlain, and you look around Leeds, the town hall, or everything you've got in Birmingham, particularly this brilliant art gallery that's pre-Raphaelite, which I strongly recommend to you, you can see what civic pride could do. The next point I make about fiscal decentralisation, one of the huge problems we have in this country is you have massive variations in regional living costs, about 16% from London to the northeast, and earnings about 44%. If you have a national system of benefits and minimum wages, etc., the replacement ratio, which is the ratio of benefits to post-tax earnings, varies wildly from place to place. One of the reasons we have huge structural unemployment in cheap areas such as Wales and the northeast is quite simply the fact the replacement ratio is far too high and it's not worth recruiting people with low levels of skill. I'm not going to absolutely terrify you. I've got here a draft note which I'm writing for the IA. I'm going to give you the ratio to gross domestic product at basic prices in 2009-10, now these are highly speculative figures, of government spending, scale so it equals 52.6 because it's used as a basic price measure in different regions of the country. North East, 73.5. Sorry.
Just maybe lean a little closer to
Okay, sorry. Right, these are figures. North East, 73.5 of GDP appears to be government spending, which is up 10% on 2004.
73.5%.
Yeah. Northwest, 64.6. Yorks and Humber, 60.5. East Midlands, which I think is the last place down to London, which pays as much in tax as it takes in spending, 53.9. West Midlands 60.5, East 44.3, London 39.1, London was 35.3 in 0405, South East 40, South West 52.8, England as a whole 50, Scotland 61.4, Wales 76.9, and Northern Ireland 80.9%. There is no Northern Irish economy. This is the fundamental political problem for the Conservatives. You've got huge areas of the country which are massively over-represented in Parliament because of problems and boundaries, where the degree of socialisation is actually on a par with Soviet Russia, because even in the Brezhnev era, the black market in Russia was 25% of the economy. You're actually looking, and then you didn't have any sort of health and safety inspection in the black market. And this is a fundamental issue. This is a big political structure problem. You've got to get a culture where everyone thinks that they can live off the state, including the middle classes. I mean, if you're a husband and wife GPs living in Wales, where property prices can be a tenth of what they are in central London, you've won the lottery. You've got these huge vested interests. And Gordon Brown massively, deliberately built up this huge articulate lobby. I think the case, if you like, for what we're doing with child benefit is if you get to the point where large parts of the articulate middle class simply pay taxes and don't get anything back, you're actually, in political economy terms, actually trying to shift the terms of the debate. I think that's rhetoric of growth. Yeah, I mean, the Tory party has been in an absolute blue funk about supply side arguments ever since maybe 1992. To me, as an economist who's not part of political aligned, I mean, it's like a flat earth society. We know vast amounts about what determines the rate of economic growth. John is entirely correct. If you look at where we are now, only a few francophone economies and a few Scandinavians actually have got a higher government spending ratio. We've also got the largest structural budget deficit in the OECD. The other point I will emphasise is when the government is spending over half of national output, and your problem is your tax base is inadequate, gross domestic product, which is half government and half private, is an irrelevant concept. The private sector saw a 13.75% contraction in its volume of activity during the course of a recent recession. That's why the tax base is collapsed. It doesn't matter if GDP falls by -5%, as long as you can get the private sector to start growing again. That's what you've got to do. The supply side is absolutely essential. And someone, somewhere, and I can't see the wealth conservating classes who run the Tory party taking this on, has got to get this across to the populace.
Okay, so perhaps, William, maybe if you focus on the question of how to create a culture of growth.
Right, I mean, sorry. I work for an American company. I spent 15 years in the States. The language of growth is something which is completely natural, and I would agree coming back here was actually, in a sense, something of a culture shock. I mean, there are lots of people out there who do want to create growth, but that, what is the balance which seems to have been struck between protection, if you will, and growth? It does seem to be, the emphasis seems to be on protection. And I mean, absolutely, there has to be a safety net. But what about growth as well? I don't see why you can't do both of them, and that does mean a tax system which encourages that, and that probably means a tax system which does less. I mean, as others have pointed out, if you have a tax system that does less, that probably means that you need to strip a whole bunch of benefits out of it. And it's not just GPs in Wales who do quite well out of this system. Actually, a fair number of corporations, including mine, like their benefits. And I always tell people when they say, what about simplicity? I say, I'll be completely honest with you. I'll trade a pound of complexity for an ounce of benefit. So everybody needs to be weaned off these benefits. But I think if you can do that, and if you can free it up, and if you can lower the rates, I would say over time, but nevertheless, if you can make that direction clear, then I think you encourage people to do that. But it is, that is not necessarily the thing. And I mean, this is a sort of almost an ancient problem. If you look back, I was not an economist, but I did read history at university. And if you look back at what people did with their money, in America, they would go out and create more money. In France, they plough it back into family firms. In England, they go out and buy a country house. I mean, the culture of growth and sort of the earning of money as being a good thing. It had its hot spots in Birmingham and Manchester, but sort of the metropolitan South never thought very much of it.
Perhaps, John, if I might ask you about the flat stuff, the flat tax. I mean, would you support perhaps raising the threshold even further than the 10,000 to pay flat compensated by some narrowing of the gap between the basic and the higher rate of income tax?
I don't have strong views on the threshold, but I think for choice I agree with David. We looked at this in previous Conservative governments and vetoed the idea of big threshold increases because we didn't want to create a whole group of people who had absolutely no interest in keeping the income tax rate down, and that is a political reality. If it's the only way that a coalition government can deliver some respite from income tax, then I will go along with it, faute de mieux, and that's where I think we currently are. I'm very grateful for the plug for johnredwood.com. I do try to keep it interesting, and even the BBC these days reads it and sometimes picks it up and uses it, which is good news. On the flat rate point generally, I'd be very happy to have a flat rate of 20%, but I don't think the political classes are ready for anything like that. George Osborne used to believe in it before he became Chancellor, but doesn't seem to anymore. I think a flat rate of 20% and a threshold of 14,000 a year would lose its revenue, and so I don't think it would be an immediate runner for that reason either. On fiscal decentralisation, I don't think the coalition government, this Parliament, will want to give any new tax to local government. I think they're right not to do so. I think local government's going to have quite a lot to do to make intelligent use of all the powers and responsibilities it is going to have from the very substantial delegations that Eric Pickles has come up with in a marvellously radical programme. And the results will be patchy around the country depending on who people have elected. It won't all be good news, but that's localism. I think user charging is probably the way to go in more areas in local government, and that is another revenue stream which they're all very conscious of. I don't like councils abusing monopoly charging on car parks where they got the stranglehold on all the crucial sites in the town. If they're in competition in car parking, that may be a different matter. I think there's a lot more scope for user charging in leisure services that councils do. They seem to have targeted the frail and the elderly through wanting more user charging on social services, which is politically fraught. But I can understand where they're coming from. And finally, on the rhetoric of growth, yes, I think we're losing this debate. I think it's there to be won again, because I do think David Cameron and George Osborne, from conversations I've had with them, both fully understand that growth is the way to get out of this, and they do want a growth strategy. I think it's now a question of putting flesh on the bones and saying to them, you've got to be much more radical to get this economy moving. For the very good reasons that David has illustrated. The economy is in a worse state than anybody really recognises in the public debate because they're using funny figures. And we're having this absurd debate that we're going to do 80% of the deficit reduction by cutting spending when the Treasury figures show we're putting spending up.
Okay, and Jesse, do you think that part of the localised big society would be an element of fiscal decentralisation?
Oh, I think it has to be. At some point, town halls have got to get some more control over the money they raise locally in order to encourage good people to come into, more good people to come into local government. I mean, you know, one of the tragedies for which I'm afraid in part Mrs. T was responsible has been the progressive impoverishment of local government over the last 30, 40 years, and we need to restore that vibrant civic culture of which Birmingham in the 19th century was such a great example. So I absolutely do think that that's a very important, although as John suggested, possibly second-term issue for a coalition or I hope Conservative government. On the other points, I mean, the reason why Slovakia had a flat tax, in part, let's not get confused about this, was because it had very low levels of tax compliance. So it set a low level to get people into the tax system in a post-Soviet context, as much as to and to make it ultra simple and easy to collect. The politics of a flat tax in this country are radically different. The Conservatives have always been split on the issue. Some people think, as John suggested, that everyone should pay some tax so they understand the pain of paying tax. Others argue that if the person's getting more in benefits, that pain is kind of irrelevant. So I myself would be a fan of raising the threshold because it has one fantastic benefit, which is it takes people out of means testing. Means testing is a very evil thing, which we should not forget. If we can keep people out of means testing, that's a very good thing. We do not want enormous numbers of people having their incentives completely distorted, filling in vast numbers of forms. We want them out there and working. And this links to the point the gentleman made earlier about a rhetoric of growth. It's vital. I mean, you just have to look at some of the literature is mentioned. I mean, William hinted at it. Martin Wiener wrote a wonderful book about the decline of the British industrial ethic. Corelli Barnett has talked about this. In America, it's still the case that if you've made $1 million, you go out and make another one, you make another one, and you stop. You don't do it because you want to make money. You maybe do it as a means of keeping score and of keeping yourself energized and your community engaged, and for all those reasons. In this country, we do not have a culture of growth. It's embedded in all kinds of class and other issues. It would be wonderful to think that we could get back to the kind of belief in business as good for oneself and good for the community that actually has characterized this country in times of past, and away from this idiotic kind of dragon's den view of entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is bloody hard work. That's what entrepreneurship is, and culture of growth, and we should support that. And I do think, I think it's easy to be rude about the new government, but the truth of the matter is there are people near the top of it who have either been in very entrepreneurial firms. George Osborne's father set up his own business, made a huge success of it. Philip Hammond's built his own business. Philip Dunn's built his own business. There are plenty of people near the top of the Conservative Party who have built successful businesses and know what it is to create wealth. And we should remember that, and let's get more of them in government and get a fiscal policy and an economic policy that's structured around building that growth.
Okay, well, I'm going to take one last question. If you could ask a question, if somebody asks a question that perhaps the panel could answer in 3 sentences.
John Walsh from Henley constituency. First of all, I would say on the in between capital gains tax and higher rate income tax, speaking as an accountant, money can easily be moved from one to the other, and I would support Nigel Lawson's position of having the same tax rate on both, whatever that is, because it capital gains tax.
To lose huge amounts of revenue by putting up the income tax, the capital gains tax rate.
Whatever the answer is, it's got to be the same answer because they're interchangeable in practice. The other thing is just to make sure that I've got that right. Is the tax take going from 510 to 690 in that little lesson we were given?
Not as high as that, because there'll still be a deficit.
There will still be a deficit at the end. And then the question is over income tax, that you need a much simpler system so that people can understand and fill in their own tax forms, and then they'll understand what they're paying. The system at the moment is so complicated that most people can't do that without help. And how would people simplify things?
So I'd say that those perhaps are both questions connected with income tax. So perhaps if one has other sorts of taxes, like capital gains tax that are at different rates, then there are incentives to adopt different kinds of, to rebadge one's income in various ways, and there are other complexities around the income tax. So is there, in addition to changing rates and so on, is there a scope perhaps to increase liberty and reduce invasion by having a much simpler basis for income tax?
So 3 sentences.
Yes, one. You can make it 4 if you might.
Okay. And the answer is you can do, but it goes back to what I was saying before. The reason why the tax system is complex is because we try and do too much through the tax system. Again, I mean, I worked for the US Treasury under Bill Clinton, and because the Republicans had taken over Congress, the only thing that could get through was credits. So we started putting credits into the tax system, something which was picked up by the last Labour government. And the more of those you put into the system, the longer the form becomes, the more complex it becomes. You can't do anything. If you try and run social policy through a tax system, you will have a complex tax system. You need to make a decision. You're going to take all of those out, and there will be a lot of screaming when that happens, because that's the way a lot of benefits are hidden, essentially.
Well, most people pay income tax through PAYE and do not complete an annual return. I share your view that I'd like it simpler, and some of my ideas would help simplify it if adopted. One thing I would draw your attention to is the current consultation the Treasury is undertaking to nationalise the payrolls in this country, and I think you may not have heard of it and you ought to respond. They've got a 3-phase approach, which is their answer to your question. Phase 1 is that all companies will have to share their weekly or monthly payroll runs with the Treasury, and if you don't have a compatible computer, you have to get one. Phase 2, the Treasury does the tax calculation for you, to try and avoid wrong code numbers and to have continuously changing code numbers from the payroll information you're submitting. And stage 3 is you send them the check for the gross amount and they decide how much your employees get. I think this goes a bit far, and I would recommend you might write in, as I've done, to Mr. Gork to say, is this really what we want to do? This is the most massive computerization system we've ever seen, and will make the NHS computer look like a picnic.
Jesse?
Well, I agree with much of that. I would say one thing, PAYE is the greatest tool of socialism ever invented. Just never forget that, okay? It encourages you to think of your pay as what you get off the government's taking its bit. Okay, in America, where everyone fills in a tax form, the pain of paying tax is very tangible. People are perfectly aware of what the problem is in the tax system when Uncle Sam comes and takes your money. In this country, we allow ourselves to be fleeced every month by the PAYE system, and with nary a whimper. And if we want to be really radical, we take a look at that. I think that would be that would cause rioting on the streets and a radical change of approach to tax policy if we implemented that.
Having mentioned David Gork, I was actually my MP, and a very nice chap, and we had a meeting last night, and I actually asked him whether they'd simulated the effects of a VAT hike in the Treasury model. And there's a momentary sort of glimpse of panic in his eyes, and when he replies, "I'm sure we did that." I actually don't think they did. And I think that there's a whole issue of the competence of the Treasury and the OBR, and we're likely to end up in a serious mess if that's not sorted. As far as taxes are concerned, obviously simplicity is a good thing. What I will say, of course, is don't forget we have basically 3 income tax systems in this country. We've got income tax, we've got employers' national insurance contributions, and we've got employees' national insurance contributions. And the feedbacks between these actually produce some horrendous effects. And people talk about 50% top rate of tax, but you know, if you're a higher earner, you've got 1.5% uncapped national insurance contributions, if my memory serves me correct, and you've got 12.8% employee earns national insurance contribution, so marginal rate of tax is 56%. If you define it properly as an economist would, which is what proportion of your marginal income goes in tax, and then about 44% that's left, about 25% of it goes in indirect taxes and council tax and things like that. People like myself, who have a good pension, have actually opted for a life of leisure. I'm 64, I gave up full time at the age of 60. I could have carried on getting up at 5 a.m, working in the city, handing tens of thousands of pounds over to the government. It just wasn't worth it. There's a sort of internal exile which affects many reasonably prosperous citizens, which is simply you give up work at the age of 55 or 60 or whatever. And those sorts of effects are actually quite powerful, and people just don't take account of them.
Okay. Well, I think we've had an interesting combination, I hope you'll agree, of talks here. So we had David to remind you with his tour d'horizon, and perhaps tour de force, warning of the impact of growth on high taxes. William has warned us of over-reliance upon headline versus effective rates, and the value of a coherent and stable approach to tax policy making. Jesse's emphasised the role of entrepreneurship and warned us of the great tools of socialism in the PAYE system and means testing. And John has advised us of quite how much taxes are going up and tirelessly urged us to aim to have lower taxes and to promote growth as the solution to our economic problems. So I hope that you've enjoyed the discussion, and I'd ask you to thank the panel in the usual way.